After 20 years, a question hangs heavier than ever. What if a marriage doesn't break because of betrayal, distance, or scandal, but because one person slowly stops seeing you as a partner and starts seeing you as a strategy? Imagine waking up one day and realizing that the vows you made weren't a shared promise at all, but a stepping stone for someone else's ascent. How would that feel? Would you stay? Would you fight? Or would you walk away in silence, carrying a truth too painful to explain? That's where this story begins, with a love that looked real from the outside, but according to Trevor Engelson, transformed into something transactional, calculated, and deeply lonely. And if you think you already know the story, ask yourself this. Why has the man who stayed quiet for decades finally chosen to hint at the real reason now? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. In the beginning, it looked like every Hollywood fairy tale the public never got to see. A young producer with grit and charisma, an aspiring actress hungry for a breakthrough. Two people hustling, dreaming, believing, laughing, and building a future that seemed aligned. They shared apartments, auditions, long nights, and the kind of optimism only people at the edge of success can feel. But even then, there was something subtle in the air, a tilt in the balance, a quiet shift in who was supporting and who was being lifted. Maybe you've experienced this. Have you ever been in a relationship where you wanted both people to win, but only one person seemed focused on crossing the finish line? Trevor believed in partnership. He believed in lifting someone you love. He believed in sacrifice. But the more Meghan's world began to expand, the more his world began to shrink in comparison. Friends at the time said the change was almost invisible at first, a tone, a dismissal, a correction, a hint that appreciation was turning into expectation. Does love survive that? Or does it slowly suffocate under the weight of ambition disguised as destiny? People forget that before the spotlight, before the royal headlines, before the global conversations about fame and identity and reinvention, there was just the two of them. A couple eating takeout on the floor. A couple celebrating small wins. A couple believing they were in it together. But here's the twist. Together meant different things to both of them. For Trevor, together meant mutual growth. For Meghan, according to his long-delayed reflections, together became a ladder to somewhere else. Have you ever suspected that someone was rehearsing a future that didn't include you? There's an irony here that's almost cinematic. Trevor was the one in the industry. Trevor was the one with the connections, the producing experience, the credibility. Yet somehow, the narrative flipped. Suddenly, he wasn't the established one supporting rising talent. He was the placeholder, the transitional figure, the before picture in someone else's transformation story. And the strangest part? He didn't fight it. He watched it unfold quietly, maybe hoping it would balance out again, maybe believing love would correct the drift. But ambition has gravity. And according to Trevor, that gravity pulled Meghan in a direction that no longer included him as an equal. You have to wonder, when did the partnership turn into positioning? When did affection turn into advantage? Was it after the auditions started turning into callbacks? Was it after the move to Toronto? Was it when her career found momentum? Or was it long before, hidden under charm and determination that looked like passion but was actually strategy? People say hindsight is sharp, but 20 years of silence sharpens it into a blade. And here's where the emotional sting deepens. Trevor didn't just lose a wife. He lost the version of himself he was in that relationship. The supportive partner, the believer, the man who thought love was enough. But love, in this story, had competition. And ambition doesn't like to share the stage. Imagine realizing that every sacrifice you made, every effort you put in, every door you opened, was interpreted not as devotion, but as utility. Have you ever helped someone succeed, only to realize they were already planning their exit? But here's the part that keeps people listening, the detail that pulls the curtain back just an inch more. Trevor says the moment he truly understood wasn't during a fight. It wasn't during the divorce. It wasn't in the public aftermath. It was in a silent moment, a look, a pause, a flash of truth where he realized he was no longer a husband, but a stepping stone. That kind of realization doesn't explode. It dissolves. Quietly. Completely. And by the time you try to grab onto something solid, it's already gone. So why now? Why, after 20 years, Does the world finally hear a hint of what really happened? Why does a man who stayed silent through fame, through the royal marriage, through the documentaries, interviews, branding, reinvention, and global spotlight, finally allow the truth to surface? Is it closure? Is it liberation? Or is it something even more compelling? Because according to Trevor, the real breaking point wasn't dramatic. It wasn't public. It wasn't loud. It was subtle. He replayed that moment in his mind for years. The stillness, the realization, the quiet collapse of something he thought was unbreakable. But here's the thing about silence. It doesn't stay silent forever. It echoes. It grows. It demands to be understood. And for Trevor, that quiet moment became the lens through which every memory suddenly looked different. The laughs, the celebrations, the shared plans, the sacrifices, all of it reframed with a single haunting question. Was it love or was it leverage? Have you ever looked back at a relationship and realized you missed the signs that were right in front of you? The compliments that felt rehearsed, the affection that felt timed, the support that only flowed one way. It's easy to romanticize the past, but it's even easier to rewrite it. And that's exactly what makes this story so compelling. Because while Meghan went on to reinvent herself again and again, Trevor stayed still. Not in bitterness, not in jealousy, but in observation. Watching someone you once loved become a global figure is a strange kind of ghosting. Not disappearance, but transformation into someone unrecognizable. People imagine divorce as an explosion, but sometimes it's erosion. A slow fading of intimacy, laughter, effort, gratitude. A transition from us to me. Trevor has never called Meghan cruel. Never attacked her character. Never exposed private details. His restraint became its own mystery. Why didn't he speak? Why didn't he correct the narrative? Why didn't he defend his role in her rise? Some say dignity. Some say heartbreak. Some say he didn't need the attention. But what if the real reason is simpler? He was processing the truth that the marriage he cherished was never the marriage she was building. Picture this. You're supporting someone's dreams, celebrating their milestones, believing in their potential, only to realize they were preparing to outgrow you from the start. That kind of realization doesn't create anger. It creates clarity. And clarity, as Trevor hints, was the real turning point. Not betrayal, not scandal, not incompatibility, but recognition that he was no longer a partner. He was a phase, a chapter, a stepping stone to a different social tier, a different narrative, a different identity entirely. And here's where the timing becomes intriguing. Why does this revelation matter now? Because 20 years later, the public perception of Meghan has shifted again. The narratives, the interviews, the reinventions, the public breakups, the shifting relationships, the self-positioning. It all casts a new light backward. Suddenly people are asking, was this pattern already visible before royalty, before fame, before global headlines? Was Trevor the first example of a cycle the world would later recognize? There's another layer here, one that makes audiences lean in. Trevor didn't just lose Meghan. He watched her become someone the world discussed, debated, dissected, adored, criticized, defended, and attacked. And through all of it, he said nothing. Silence became the most powerful statement he could make. But silence also creates speculation. And speculation brings curiosity. And curiosity is what pulls viewers deeper into the story. Because now, finally, he has offered a glimpse into the truth. A sentence, a reflection, a confession wrapped in understatement. Our marriage became a career strategy, not a partnership. 10 words that reopen a story the world thought was already finished. 10 words that change how people interpret everything that came after. 10 words that transform a forgotten ex-husband into the one person who saw the earliest version of a pattern. But here is the emotional center of the introduction. Trevor wasn't angry. He was disappointed. And disappointment is far more powerful than rage. Rage ends quickly. Disappointment lingers. It reshapes identity. It forces self-reflection. And it makes you wonder whether love blinded you, or whether you simply hoped too much. Ask yourself this. Have you ever believed in someone more than they believed in you? Have you ever given without expecting repayment, only to discover the other person was keeping a tally? Have you ever realized you were in a relationship alone long before it officially ended? That's the emotional hook that connects the audience to Trevor's story. Because this isn't just celebrity gossip. It's a universal human wound. And then comes the deeper irony. While Meghan went on to marry into royalty, reshape her public identity, and redefine herself yet again, Trevor found something she didn't expect. Peace, happiness, stability. A new life that didn't require branding, storytelling, interviews, or reinvention. And that contrast raises a question that lingers beneath the surface of the entire video. Who really won? But before we get there, before we peel back the layers, before we trace the first cracks in the relationship, before we uncover the moment Trevor sensed he was being positioned rather than loved, we need to go back to the beginning. To the first meeting, to the spark, to the charm, to the red flag no one noticed. Because the truth didn't reveal itself at the end. It was there at the start, hiding in plain sight. What if the moment you met someone, the moment that felt like fate, chemistry, magic, was actually the moment you ignored the first warning sign? What if the spark that drew you in was the same flame that would eventually burn everything down? People love the idea of destiny, of chance encounters, of love arriving in cinematic fashion. But Trevor Engelson now looks back at that first meeting and sees something he didn't see then. A glimmer, a calculation, a subtle assessment behind the smile. Have you ever replayed the beginning of a relationship and realized it meant something completely different than you believed at the time? They met in a world buzzing with ambition, auditions, scripts, late-night industry conversations, and the intoxicating smell of possibility. Los Angeles has a way of making everyone feel like they're one moment away from being discovered, chosen, elevated. Trevor was already carving out his path in film production. Respected, connected, steadily rising through persistence rather than hype. Meghan, on the other hand, was still on the outskirts of recognition, circling opportunity, charming rooms, hungry for momentum. Their meeting felt natural, effortless, aligned. Two people who understood the grind. Two people who spoke the same language of hustle. But beneath that connection was a tiny imbalance. One of them had already built a ladder. The other was looking for one. In those early days, everyone saw chemistry, laughter, spark, energy. But Trevor now admits there was something else too. Something he dismissed as confidence, ambition, drive. She had a way of making every interaction feel intentional, every conversation feel rehearsed, every compliment land like it was part of a bigger script. Most people would call that charisma. But looking back, he wonders, was it performance? Have you ever met someone who seemed too polished, too prepared, too aware of the effect they had on others? Friends of Trevor remember how quickly he became invested. He liked her wit, her charm, her warmth. He liked that she believed in her future as much as he believed in his. But here's where the first red flag whispers through the memory. When people asked Meghan what she liked about Trevor, her answers were different. She didn't describe who he was. She described where he was going. She didn't speak about connection. She spoke about proximity to the industry. It sounded flattering at the time. Now it sounds strategic. Have you ever realized someone was admiring your utility more than your humanity? But Trevor didn't see it. Why would he? People in love don't analyze. They feel. They hope. They project. He introduced her to colleagues, to opportunities, to circles she hadn't entered yet. Not because she asked, because he cared. Because that's what supportive partners do. But slowly, subtly, that support began to shift into expectation. A door opened became a door owed. A favor became a minimum standard. A gesture became a baseline. And Trevor, wanting to be generous, didn't notice the shift. He didn't notice that he was giving more than she was appreciating. Have you ever kept giving because stopping would force you to admit the imbalance? One moment stands out in Trevor's memory. Early in their relationship, before she landed steady acting work, before the world learned her name. They were at a gathering, surrounded by producers, actors, writers, the usual Los Angeles cocktail of inflated dreams and fragile egos. Someone asked Meghan what she wanted out of her career. She didn't hesitate. She said she wanted influence. Not storytelling. Not artistry. Not expression. Influence. A strange word, Trevor thought at the time, but he brushed it off. Now, that word feels like a prophecy. Influence isn't about craft. It's about positioning. It's about leverage. It's about being seen. And according to Trevor, that hunger eventually seeped into the relationship itself. Still, the early days were filled with sweetness. Movie nights, shared ambitions, Inside jokes. Weekend escapes. The kind of intimacy that feels like the world is shrinking down to two people. And yet, even in those softest moments, there were tiny details that didn't quite fit. She loved being admired. She needed validation from outside the relationship. Compliments from others lit her up more than compliments from him. Approval mattered. Status mattered. Perception mattered. Have you ever dated someone who wasn't just living life, but curating it? There's a story Trevor recalls privately, one that captures the first crack he didn't recognize as a crack. They were at dinner, just the two of them, relaxed, laughing, unwinding from long days. The waiter didn't recognize Trevor, but he recognized her from a small roll. Just a quick spark of acknowledgement. But the shift in her was immediate. Posture changed. Tone changed. She leaned into it like oxygen. Trevor thought it was cute at the time. Now, he admits, it felt like watching someone taste the thing they wanted more than love. Relationships often reveal themselves not through grand events, but through subtle patterns. When Trevor succeeded, she appreciated it. When Meghan succeeded, she expected him to amplify it. Support was not mutual, it was directional. But love can disguise those patterns, especially when you're proud of someone. Especially when you want them to shine. Especially when you believe you're building a future together instead of building a platform for someone else to leap from. And here's where the emotional twist deepens. Trevor wasn't naive. He wasn't weak. He wasn't blinded. He was in love. And love makes effort feel noble. It makes sacrifice feel romantic. It makes imbalance feel temporary. But looking back, he sees that the relationship wasn't growing equally. He was rooting for both of them. She was rooting for herself. That's the kind of realization that only arrives years later, long after the story has ended. But the audience needs to wonder, was this really the first red flag? Or was there something even earlier? Something even quieter? Something that would only make sense in hindsight? Because just when it seemed like the relationship was deepening, just when the commitment began to solidify, just when the outside world thought they were becoming inseparable, something happened that shifted the entire dynamic, even if Trevor didn't recognize it at the time. Trevor remembered another moment that didn't feel important at the time, but now stands out like a flashing warning light. They were talking about the future, about marriage, family, roots, traditions. Trevor spoke about love, partnership, building something stable and meaningful. Meghan spoke about visibility, relevance, trajectory. Not happiness, not intimacy. Trajectory. As if life were a staircase and she was already calculating how high she could climb. At the time, Trevor thought it was just ambition. Now, he wonders whether he completely misunderstood what she valued. Have you ever had a conversation that only made sense years later, when the truth finally caught up to it? People close to them would later say that Meghan had a gift. She could make anyone feel like they were the most important person in the room, until someone more useful walked in. Trevor didn't see it then. Why would he? When you're the one someone is focused on, you don't notice how quickly that focus shifts with others. But friends noticed. Not loudly, not critically, just enough to comment in passing, with a tone that implied concern wrapped in politeness. But Trevor defended her every time. He thought they didn't understand her. He thought they misread her ambition as manipulation. Have you ever defended someone not because you were sure they were right, but because admitting the truth meant questioning everything? Their early relationship moved quickly, faster than most. But not because of passion alone. It moved quickly because Meghan was always accelerating, always reaching for the next milestone, the next impression, the next validation. Trevor mistook momentum for chemistry. He mistook urgency for compatibility. There is a kind of person who can make you feel like you're falling behind if you don't keep up with their pace. And Trevor, wanting to nurture, wanting to support, wanting to believe he had found someone extraordinary, matched that pace without realizing it wasn't love accelerating, it was ambition. There was another moment, subtle but unforgettable in hindsight. Meghan once said, half joking but not really joking, that she wanted a life people would talk about. Not a life she would enjoy. Not a life she would grow in. A life people would talk about. That's not a dream, that's a brand. Trevor now sees that line as the seed of everything that followed. Because a life crafted for attention requires roles, positioning, narrative arcs, and every narrative needs characters that can be replaced when the story evolves. Still, Trevor loved her. And love makes excuses. Love fills in the blanks with generosity. Love assumes the best intentions. He saw her determination and thought it was admirable. He saw her hunger for success and thought it was resilience. He saw her self-promotion and thought it was confidence. But years later, when he repeated the sentence that now defines his reflection, our marriage became a career strategy. It cast a shadow backward over every memory, every early conversation, every red flag he ignored. Relationships don't tilt all at once. They shift degree by degree, like a picture frame slightly crooked on a wall. You don't notice it happening. You only notice when it's suddenly glaringly off balance. That's how it was with Trevor and Meghan. What started as mutual admiration slowly became uneven attention. What began as partnership slowly became performance. And what looked like compatibility slowly revealed itself as convenience. A convenience that benefited only one side. One night, long before the proposal, long before the move, long before the wedding, Trevor recalled hearing Meghan describe him to someone new. Not as someone she loved. Not as someone who understood her. Not as someone who made her feel safe or inspired or cherished. She described him by his job, by his industry standing, by his connections. It felt strange. It felt transactional. But he brushed it aside. People speak differently in public, he told himself. But now, he admits, that moment may have been the first time he was no longer a person, but a stepping stone in someone else's ascent. And yet, despite these signs, despite these subtle imbalances, despite these glimpses into a truth he couldn't yet name, Trevor moved forward. He opened his heart further. He deepened the commitment. He believed the relationship would evolve into something more grounded, more reciprocal, more authentic. Because that's what people do when they're invested. They hope. They imagine potential. They assume growth. But love cannot fix what was never mutual to begin with. Friends later said that Trevor was the anchor and Meghan was the kite. And at first, that felt poetic. But anchors don't just hold things down. They hold things steady. Kites, however, are designed to leave, to rise, to drift toward greater air currents. And sometimes, the string that connects them isn't a bond, it's a restraint. Looking back, Trevor wonders whether the very stability he offered was the thing that made him temporary in her story. But here is the most important piece of the chapter. The audience must understand that the first red flag wasn't dramatic. It wasn't confrontational. It wasn't painful at the time. It was quiet. It was subtle. It was easy to miss. And that's what makes it compelling. Because the warning signs that define our future rarely announce themselves. They whisper. They flicker. They hide inside the moments we romanticize. And just when it seemed like the relationship was entering a deeper phase, just when commitment appeared to solidify, just when Trevor thought he had found someone to build a life with, something happened that seemed insignificant at the time, but would later become the turning point that explained everything. Because the first red flag didn't reveal the truth. What happens when one person is building a life, and the other is building a launchpad? What happens when devotion meets ambition, not as partners, but as opposing forces pulling in different directions? Trevor Engelson now says that he didn't notice the imbalance at first. He didn't see love turning into leverage. He didn't recognize that he was investing emotionally while Meghan was investing strategically. But looking back, he can trace the moment he realized he was cheering for both of them, while she was only cheering for herself. Have you ever woken up inside a relationship and realized you were the only one clapping? In the early years, Trevor poured himself into the partnership. He cooked, he reassured, he encouraged, he funded, he opened doors, he lifted, he reassured again, he believed. That's who he was, a builder, a supporter, a man who thought success meant rising together. But slowly, he noticed something unsettling. Whenever he achieved something, Meghan celebrated politely, lightly, briefly. But when she achieved something, she expected a spotlight, reinforcement, amplification. Trevor didn't resent it. He understood the entertainment world, the fragile egos, the insecurity beneath glamour. But somewhere along the way, her wins became shared victories, and his became footnotes. Have you ever been in a relationship where your joy mattered less? There was a moment that marked the beginning of this shift. Trevor had secured a production milestone he had worked toward for years, a project that proved his credibility, his persistence, his talent. He expected excitement, pride, maybe even celebration. But Meghan barely reacted. She pivoted the conversation back to her auditions, her callbacks, her near misses, her possibilities. At the time, Trevor interpreted it as nerves, stress, pressure. Now, he interprets it differently. He believes she couldn't celebrate him because his success didn't benefit her trajectory. That realization doesn't arrive in a flash. It arrives slowly, like light exposing a room inch by inch. Meanwhile, Trevor continued to show up fully. He rearranged his schedule for her. He made sacrifices, cancellations, adjustments, compromises. In most relationships, those gestures are mutual. But in this one, something subtle happened. Meghan treated those sacrifices as defaults. Expected. Normal. And when she made even a small adjustment for Trevor, it was framed as generosity, as though she had gifted him something extraordinary. Have you ever felt like the things you gave freely were taken as obligation? This dynamic deepened as Meghan began to gain small footholds in the industry. Bit roles, one-liners, short arcs, commercial spots. Each step forward brought not gratitude, but entitlement. Trevor now sees that each success didn't make her more grounded. It made her more convinced she was destined for something bigger. And if she was destined for something bigger, then the people around her, including Trevor, were either assets or obstacles. Not companions, not equals. Assets or obstacles. That kind of mindset turns relationships into ladders. Friends remember seeing the imbalance long before Trevor did. They saw him adjusting his world to make room for hers. They saw her expecting the adjustment without offering one in return. They didn't criticize her. They simply noticed the math didn't add up. But people in love don't calculate. They rationalize. Trevor told himself she was stressed, striving, under pressure, still finding her path. He told himself she didn't mean to overshadow him. He told himself it would balance out later. But imbalance rarely balances. It widens. Things grew more complicated when Meghan began comparing their careers, subtly, casually, but consistently. Not in a playful way. Not with admiration. With competitiveness. She wanted to rise faster. She wanted to be seen more. She wanted recognition sooner. She once joked, though it didn't sound like a joke, that she deserved fame more because she was the one in front of the camera. Trevor laughed at the time. Now, he realizes he laughed to avoid confronting a truth he didn't want to see. Have you ever laughed at something that hurt because acknowledging it would have changed everything? And then there was the emotional imbalance. When Trevor felt overwhelmed, she offered motivation, but not comfort. When Meghan felt overwhelmed, Trevor offered comfort, solutions, reassurance, loyalty. Emotional generosity flowed in one direction. She needed him. He wanted her. Need feels like control. Want feels like vulnerability. That difference weakened the foundation of the relationship without either of them naming it. One evening stands out more vividly than others. Trevor had planned a quiet celebration for a shared milestone, something meaningful to both of them, something rooted in love rather than ambition. But Meghan arrived distracted, disengaged, scrolling through her phone, waiting for an email about a role she might, or might not, get. Trevor paused. He watched her. He felt something crack internally. Not loudly, not sharply, softly. A realization that he was no longer a priority. He was a placeholder, filling space until something more advantageous arrived. There's another layer here, a painful one. As Meghan's ambitions intensified, she began subtly reshaping the narrative of the relationship. She positioned herself as the striving dreamer and Trevor as the man comfortable with mediocrity, even though he was the one with the established career. It was a reversal of truth, a reframing that made her ascent seem heroic and his stability seem stagnant. And Trevor, not wanting conflict, let the narrative stand. Have you ever allowed someone to misrepresent reality because correcting them would expose how differently you saw the world? But the most telling shift came not in words, but in energy. When they entered rooms together, Meghan wanted to be perceived as the star. When Trevor introduced her to industry peers, she acted as though they were discovering her, not being introduced. She needed admiration from others more than intimacy with him. That's not partnership. That's audience seeking. And relationships cannot survive when one person needs applause more than connection. As time passed, Trevor continued to root for both of them. He believed success would strengthen the relationship. He believed shared goals would unite them. He believed love would make ambition collaborative rather than competitive. But Meghan's path didn't widen to include him. It narrowed to focus on herself. And with each step forward she took, Trevor felt himself being pushed slightly further to the edges of her story. What's haunting is that Trevor never complained. He never confronted. He never accused. Because he believed this phase would pass. He believed she would eventually see him again, not as a resource, but as a partner. But according to him now, she never did. Not once. Not in the beginning. Not in the middle. Not at the end. This chapter must leave the audience wondering, did Meghan ever see the relationship as mutual? Or was it always a stepping stone? Was Trevor ever a partner in her eyes? Or was he simply the right man at the right time with the right connections until something better came along? Because just when Trevor thought the imbalance was temporary, just when he convinced himself the emotional scales would level, just when he believed the relationship was strengthening, the distance began. Not emotional distance, physical distance. Hollywood doesn't just change careers. It changes identities. It changes priorities. It changes the way people measure love, loyalty, and value. For Trevor Engelson, the entertainment industry had always been a workplace, demanding, unpredictable, exhausting, but a workplace nonetheless. For Meghan, according to the reflections he shares now, Hollywood became oxygen. And when something becomes oxygen, everything else becomes optional. Have you ever loved someone who slowly started loving the spotlight more than they loved you? The shift didn't happen overnight. It happened in increments, tiny, almost invisible adjustments that only made sense when seen in reverse. Meghan's first consistent acting roles didn't just bring income or confidence. They brought attention. They brought flattery. They brought the intoxicating feeling of being chosen. Suddenly, auditions weren't just opportunities, they were validation. Casting directors weren't professionals, they were gatekeepers of identity. And Meghan began to organize her emotional life around the opinions of strangers. Trevor watched this change with pride at first, but pride eventually turned into confusion. Confusion turned into concern. Concern turned into the ache of irrelevance. Hollywood has a way of blurring boundaries. Work becomes identity. Publicity becomes personality. Roles become self-perception. Meghan began describing herself not by who she was, but by the characters she played, the scripts she auditioned for, the personas she was crafting. Trevor, grounded and steady, still defined himself by relationships, values, consistency. They were no longer speaking the same emotional language. Have you ever been in a relationship where you felt like the other person was drifting into a world you couldn't follow? Not because you lacked ambition, but because you refused to replace authenticity with performance? The first real shift came when Meghan landed a role that required shooting out of town. It was temporary at first, a few weeks, then a few months, then a recurring stretch. Distance wasn't the problem. Trevor believed in independence. He believed in supporting her opportunities. But something else happened, something much harder to name. The distance didn't create longing. It created rewriting. When Meghan returned home, she didn't speak like someone who missed him. She spoke like someone evaluating whether he still fit into the next version of her life. There was a moment that now feels like a turning point. Trevor had flown out to visit her, surprising her after weeks apart. He expected excitement, relief, intimacy. Instead, she reacted with inconvenience, as though his presence disrupted a narrative she was curating. She didn't embrace him. She didn't pull him close. She asked why he came without warning. That question became a bruise he didn't acknowledge. Have you ever surprised someone you love and realized the surprise exposed the distance rather than bridged it? Meanwhile, Meghan's co-workers, castmates, and industry acquaintances became her emotional circle. They shared set stories, spotlight struggles, ego wounds, and fame fantasies. Trevor couldn't compete with that environment. Not because he lacked depth, but because Hollywood rewards self-absorption disguised as artistry. Meghan began saying things like, "You don't understand my world anymore." But Trevor hadn't moved. She had, and she needed to frame the shift as his inadequacy rather than her detachment. Hollywood didn't just change her schedule. It changed her self-concept. She began crafting a narrative in which she was the underdog heroine. The woman rising from obscurity, misunderstood, underappreciated, destined for greatness. In that storyline, Trevor no longer fit as a partner. He fit as a preface, a supporting character, a warm-up to the main act. And she began behaving accordingly. There was another moment that Trevor recalls with unsettling clarity. They attended an industry event together while Meghan's profile was rising. Someone approached them, not to congratulate Trevor on his work, but to fawn over Meghan's latest appearance. The attention was brief, shallow, forgettable to most. But Meghan's expression changed. It wasn't joy. It wasn't gratitude. It was hunger. A spark that said, "This is what I deserve." From that night forward, Trevor noticed she no longer introduced him as someone she loved. She introduced him as someone accompanying her. A placement, not a partner. Have you ever felt yourself becoming background in your own relationship? The distance between them became emotional before it became practical. Meghan's conversation shifted. She no longer talked about shared dreams. She talked about her next breakthrough. She no longer asked for Trevor's thoughts. She asked for his advantages. She no longer cared about the life they were building. She cared about the life she was curating. And every time Trevor tried to pull them back into intimacy, she pivoted into ambition. Then came the move to Toronto for Suits. This was the moment everything snapped into place, not in conflict, but in clarity. Trevor encouraged her, supported her, helped her transition, reassured her they would make it work. But the space between them widened, not because of geography, but because Meghan no longer needed a partner. She needed a narrative. And that narrative required her to appear independent, ascending, reinvented. A husband didn't fit the story arc, not unless he was useful to the brand. Phone calls became shorter. Texts became delayed. Affection became sporadic. Meghan began speaking about her life there as though Trevor were an outsider rather than the person she was building a future with. She adopted new habits, new attitudes, new social postures. She became the version of herself she believed the industry wanted. Trevor wasn't losing a wife. He was losing a person he no longer recognized. Friends asked him whether he was worried. Trevor said no. He said love could withstand distance. He said ambition was exciting. He said he was proud of her. But deep down, something was shifting, a sense that he was no longer part of her evolution. That feeling grew when Meghan stopped asking about his projects altogether. She didn't just forget, she dismissed. His success didn't elevate her. Therefore, it didn't matter. And then came the sentence. The one Trevor says he never forgot. During a call, after he congratulated her again on her growing momentum, she said, "This is just the beginning. I'm meant for something bigger. Not we. I. Not us. I. Not partnership. Trajectory." Trevor ended the call smiling, but inside something collapsed. He didn't know it then, but that sentence would become the defining truth of their marriage. Because a person who believes they are meant for something bigger eventually believes they are meant for someone else. Hollywood didn't just change Meghan's career. It changed her loyalty. It changed her identity. It changed her marriage. And just when Trevor thought the distance couldn't grow any wider, the envelope arrived. Cold. Unexpected. Final. Can physical distance ever break a bond? Or does emotional distance do the real damage? For Trevor Engelson, the answer became painfully clear during Meghan's long stints in Toronto filming Suits. The miles weren't the problem, the silence was. And the way silence grew, stretched, and settled between them was almost imperceptible at first. A missed call here, a delayed reply there, a conversation that ended abruptly. It's subtle, almost invisible, until one day you realize the distance has become permanent, not temporary. Have you ever felt someone slipping away without them saying a word? At first, Trevor tried to rationalize. Filming schedules are brutal. Time zones are confusing. Stress happens. He sent messages with jokes, videos, words of encouragement. But responses were clipped. Conversations became transactional. Updates about schedules, logistics, minor incidents on set. Nothing intimate. Nothing warm. Trevor felt the slow erosion of connection. And yet, he convinced himself it was temporary, believing that love could bridge gaps that ambition created. But gaps, when left unchecked, become chasms. Trevor remembers the nights vividly, waiting for her to call after long days, only to hear a brief, distracted voice. The excitement, the warmth, the laughter that once defined their relationship had migrated somewhere else. And he began noticing patterns that once might have seemed minor, but now screamed imbalance. She was living a life out of sync with the person he knew. She spoke about Toronto not as a shared experience, but as a stage she occupied alone. Have you ever realized someone is no longer inviting you into their world, but but merely informing you of it? Friends try to reach out. They sense the tension. Subtle comments like, "She's been distant lately, haven't you noticed?" Or, "Are you both still connecting the way you used to?" Trevor shrugged. He told himself he was imagining things. He told himself that she was stressed, focused, building her career. But deep down, the truth was creeping in. Emotional distance grows faster than any physical separation, and it can destroy intimacy before either party realizes what's happening. Trevor recalls one particular trip to Toronto. He flew out to surprise her, thinking the visit would restore some sense of closeness. But when he arrived, she was occupied. Meetings, calls, errands, industry obligations. She greeted him politely, smiled, hugged, but the energy he remembered from the early days wasn't there. The warmth was muted. The connection had thinned. That moment was subtle but brutal, like stepping on ice that's already cracking beneath your feet. He tried to laugh it off, make jokes, reminisce, but he sensed the distance, the emotional gap, more vividly than ever before. It's a unique kind of heartbreak, realizing someone you love is physically present but emotionally absent. Have you ever felt that? Meanwhile, their communication rhythms shifted. Treasured conversations about dreams, fears, and plans were replaced by brief logistical check-ins. She updated him about her projects, her additions, her meetings, her day-to-day life in Toronto, but he wasn't part of the narrative anymore. The sense of partnership, the core of marriage, was slowly being replaced by reporting lines. He wasn't a confidant. He was an observer, a spectator, a placeholder. And yet, he continued to show up, continue to hope, continue to believe. That's the cruelty of hope. It can blind even the most perceptive. There's a specific story that Trevor recalls as emblematic of this phase. He arranged a dinner during one of his visits. He prepared little gestures, remembered her favorite wine, booked a table with the view she loved, and even had tickets to a small event she had mentioned months prior. It was intimate, personal, thoughtful. When she arrived, she barely noticed. She complimented the effort lightly, then returned to her phone, checking emails and texts. Trevor realized, in that moment, the emotional partnership he valued was no longer mutual. She was living in her own orbit, orbiting opportunities, connections, and ambitions, not him. Have you ever realized the person you love had moved their center of gravity away from you? The emotional consequences were profound. Trevor began feeling invisible, not because she ignored him intentionally, but because her world had expanded beyond the scope of their relationship. Her ambitions weren't small or superficial, they were immense. And immense ambitions often leave little room for the person who anchored you. He tried to recalibrate, to connect, to communicate, to bridge the gap, but it wasn't reciprocated. She was charting a path he could not influence. That's the subtle heartbreak, loving someone whose trajectory no longer intersects with yours. Over time, even when they were in the same city, Trevor felt the distance. Conversations were distracted, dinners rushed, shared moments fragmented by schedules or interruptions. It's a paradox, proximity without presence. Physical closeness did not guarantee emotional connection. And each day, the realization that he was losing intimacy, trust, and partnership without confrontation, without accusation, left a mark deeper than any argument ever could. Have you ever been in a room with someone and felt completely alone? And then, a turning point. A seemingly mundane moment that revealed the full weight of the emotional gap. Trevor had prepared a detailed plan for a weekend together, intending to reignite closeness. He expected enthusiasm, gratitude, excitement. She responded with polite compliance, distracted conversation, and a vague promise to discuss details later. The subtle dismissal hit him like a wave. The love that had once been active, engaging, and mutual was now passive, fragmented, and transactional. He felt it then, but he didn't yet name it. Sometimes, the hardest truths arrive without words. Trevor began reflecting privately. Was the distance inevitable? Was it her ambition? Was it the natural drift of two lives growing at different paces? Or was it something more fundamental, a conscious or unconscious prioritization of self over the relationship? These questions lingered, but he lacked answers. What he did feel was the slow erosion of a bond he had thought unbreakable. And that erosion, more than any fight, more than any argument, was what eventually led him to the heartbreaking clarity. The marriage was shifting from partnership into performance, and he was no longer an actor with equal weight on the stage. Friends noticed the shift too. They saw him trying, hoping, compromising, giving. They saw her excelling, moving, ascending, performing. They whispered gentle warnings, but Trevor often dismissed them, saying he understood her life required focus. But deep down, he knew something fundamental had changed. And as the months in Toronto stretched into years, that gap only widened. The distance wasn't just in miles, it was in attention, in energy, in priority. Emotional neglect, unintentional or otherwise, can fracture intimacy faster than betrayal, and Trevor felt it acutely. Finally, the envelope arrived. Cold, formal, unexpected. It wasn't angry words, accusations, or confrontations. It was quiet. It was silent. It was final. A reminder that the emotional distance had a practical conclusion. He had been losing the partnership all along, but the distance made it irreversible. The act of receiving it crystallized the emotional erosion into something tangible. The relationship he had fought for, hoped for, invested in, it was ending, and there was nothing left to salvage. Can the way a marriage ends hurt more than the love that built it? For Trevor Engelson, the divorce delivery was unlike anything he had imagined. There were no shouting matches, no courtroom confrontations, no public drama at first. Just a quiet, almost clinical notification that the partnership he had poured himself into was over. And in that quietness, he felt the sharpest sting, not from betrayal, not from humiliation, but from the realization that everything he had believed about their shared life had been reframed by someone else. Have you ever had the ground beneath you quietly disappear? Trevor recalls the day vividly. He was home, unsuspecting, when an email appeared. Polite, formal, matter of fact. It was from her representatives. The words were precise, almost bureaucratic. This is to notify you that proceedings will begin. The casual, almost indifferent tone made it feel like he was reading an instruction manual rather than a communication between partners who had once vowed love, support, and shared dreams. The absence of warmth, acknowledgement, or even empathy carved a hollow in him that words alone couldn't fill. Have you ever received news that felt more like a professional memo than an emotional revelation? The months leading up to this moment had already eroded him. Small conversations that should have been intimate had been replaced with logistics. Expressions of love replaced by casual mentions of her next project, her next engagement, her next move. He had hoped distance would be temporary. He had hoped her career would eventually circle back to make room for him. But the envelope crystallized a truth he had been avoiding. She had already moved on emotionally, strategically, and publicly, and he had been left as a silent observer, not a participant. Have you ever watched someone you love become a stranger while sharing the same space? But here is the twist. The delivery itself, though clinical, was almost a relief. The quiet, unemotional format removed the agony of confrontation, the theatrics of anger, the chaos of argument. It allowed Trevor a strange kind of clarity. He could see the facts, the distance, the imbalance in sharp relief. And yet, clarity brought with it another wave of pain. The realization that the relationship he had invested in, fought for, and hoped to nurture had been interpreted not as love, but as a convenience, a stepping stone, a necessary phase in someone else's trajectory. Friends and family were bewildered by his composure. Some expected rage, bitterness, or public outrage. But Trevor, true to his reflective nature, remained silent externally. He understood something fundamental. Confrontation wouldn't recover what had already been lost, and releasing it publicly wouldn't change the emotional calculus of a marriage that had shifted from partnership to strategy long before the legal papers arrived. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones you fight within yourself, quietly, unseen, unheard. There were moments, though, when the pain crept in unexpectedly. Small triggers, tiny reminders, the familiar scent of her perfume, a memory of a laugh, a shared joke, a photograph tucked in a drawer, all of it became emotional landmines. Trevor would recall these details, sometimes smiling at the nostalgia, sometimes grimacing at the irony, wondering how a life that had begun with hope and devotion could become so transactional. And in these reflective moments, the question haunted him. Had she ever loved him as he had loved her? Or had she only ever loved the potential he represented in the context of her ambitions? As the divorce proceedings unfolded, the emotional weight compounded. Lawyers, agreements, logistics. These practicalities were necessary, but they also underscored the transactional nature of the dissolution. Trevor's contributions, sacrifices, support, all of it became numbers, divisions of assets, procedural steps. Love transformed into liability. Memories transformed into documentation. And yet, he maintained his composure, not from indifference, but from an internal understanding that some things, once reframed, cannot be reclaimed. Trevor's friends later said they saw the toll in his quiet moments, in the late nights, the reflective silences, the occasional sighs that betrayed the emotional labor he had carried alone. But there were also moments of insight. He realized that the divorce was not simply an ending, but also a revelation. It revealed the true dynamics of the marriage, the hidden priorities, the unspoken ambitions, and the subtle recalibrations that had been at play from early on. Understanding doesn't heal instantly, but it provides perspective. And perspective, while painful, is liberating. He remembers a conversation with a close friend after the divorce papers had been served. The friend asked if he was angry. Trevor paused. He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "It's not anger. It's disappointment. And disappointment lasts longer. Anger burns out. Disappointment reshapes you. And it teaches you what you need to see before it's too late." That reflection encapsulated a painful clarity. The marriage had ended not with a dramatic rupture, but with the slow, almost invisible transformation from connection to convenience. And he, once a partner, had become a participant only in perception, not in practice. But here is the final twist of this chapter. Trevor realized that the moment he received the formal notice wasn't the end of the emotional journey. It was the beginning. A beginning of reflection, of naming truths that had been inconvenient to confront. The envelope wasn't just legal, it was symbolic. A marker that his devotion had been misinterpreted, misallocated, and ultimately unnecessary in the narrative that had been written without him. And as he looked back, he understood that the hardest part of the divorce wasn't loss, it was recognition. Recognition that the partnership he believed in had never been fully shared. And just when Trevor thought he had processed the depth of this hurt, just when he thought he understood the dynamics fully, something happened that reframed everything again. Something subtle, almost invisible, but undeniable. A revelation that would alter his understanding of the marriage, the divorce, and the person he had known all along. What happens when a marriage stops being about love and starts being about image? When the shared life you believed in becomes a carefully curated narrative designed to benefit one person, how do you reconcile what was real with what was performed? Trevor Engelson now admits that after the divorce, he realized the marriage had slowly transformed into something transactional long before any papers were signed. He wasn't a partner. He was part of a storyline, a character in someone else's trajectory. Have you ever wondered if the love you gave was ever truly valued, or just strategically used? It wasn't dramatic at first. It was subtle. It was a recalibration of reality that began early on, in small ways. Compliments that once felt intimate became public statements. Conversations about dreams became platforms for showcasing ambition. Sacrifices he made were framed not as acts of devotion, but as expected duties, background moves in a carefully choreographed performance. Trevor hadn't noticed because he believed in partnership, in mutual growth, in shared effort. But slowly, the scales tilted, almost imperceptibly, until he realized he had been giving more than he was receiving, emotionally, practically, and psychologically. Trevor recalls attending industry events with Meghan during the early rise of her career. At first, they appeared as a couple, aligned, supportive, connected. But subtle cues began to appear. She was always the focus of conversations, always the center of attention. Trevor found himself fading into the background, not by choice, but by design. The narrative had shifted. He asked himself, was this about her brilliance, or about the way brilliance could be leveraged? The realization was uncomfortable, almost invisible at first, but it settled like a shadow over his memories. Friends noticed the shift too. They commented on how Meghan seemed to navigate every interaction with a calculated charm, an awareness of who was watching and what impression to leave. Meanwhile, Trevor's presence became secondary, auxiliary, almost incidental. People in love often ignore subtle manipulation for the sake of connection. Trevor did. He rationalized, explained away, believed in the facade of mutual ambition. But hindsight made the pattern unmistakable. The transactional nature of the relationship began to seep into everyday life. Social media posts, public appearances, interviews, everything was curated. Trevor noticed that shared moments weren't celebrated privately, but were staged for visibility, for optics, for external validation. Every gesture, every laugh, every nod was measured against potential exposure. The intimacy he valued was filtered, repackaged, and presented externally. And he realized the most painful part. He had been complicit in this without knowing it. By supporting her rise, he had inadvertently facilitated the very narrative that excluded him. There was a turning point that crystallized this awareness. Trevor had discovered a pattern in which his own contributions, his sacrifices, his support, were treated as baseline expectations. Conversely, her successes were amplified, broadcast, dissected, and praised publicly, while his remained footnotes. The imbalance wasn't just emotional. It was structural. The marriage itself had been subtly rebranded into a vehicle for her ambitions, and he had been positioned as a support character rather than an equal protagonist. Have you ever realized that the story you were living wasn't yours at all? Trevor describes a moment of clarity during a private conversation. He told a close friend, "I realized that the partnership I thought we had was, in many ways, never really shared. I was participating in a marriage that had been quietly redirected toward her career, her image, her future. I loved her, yes, but I also realized that love alone doesn't anchor someone whose path is elsewhere." That reflection highlights the duality of human experience. Devotion can coexist with strategic displacement. Affection can exist alongside ambition, and emotional investment can be repurposed without consent. Yet, Trevor also acknowledges the irony. He doesn't cast blame, at least not entirely. He recognizes that ambition is human, that striving is natural, that people pursue their visions in the ways they know best. His regret is not that she sought greatness, but that the path she chose didn't include him as an equal. And therein lies the heartbreak. Partnership requires reciprocity, alignment, shared priority. Without it, love becomes transactional, no matter how genuine it initially felt. The public narrative also exacerbated the private reality. Outside observers assumed the marriage was a standard Hollywood romance, two people supporting each other through career pressures. No one recognized the subtle shift, the quiet extraction of emotional energy, the gradual reorientation of priority toward a singular ambition. Trevor stayed silent, partly out of dignity, partly out of disbelief, partly because the full understanding of what had occurred only crystallized years later. And then came the moments after divorce that confirmed what he had begun to suspect all along. Observing her public trajectory, reading interviews, witnessing her strategic positioning, he saw the marriage reframed in ways that elevated her narrative while diminishing his contributions. The realization was bitter but clarifying. It confirmed the subtle truth he had sensed during the marriage. He had been participating in a carefully designed story that benefited her, not a mutually constructed life. Trevor's reflections offer a profound lesson about human relationships. Ambition and partnership can coexist, but only when aligned. When one partner's trajectory becomes dominant, when success is measured externally rather than mutually, love can inadvertently become a strategy. And in the case of Trevor and Meghan, the transformation of the marriage into a strategic platform was almost invisible until the divorce crystallized it fully. But just when he thought he had dissected and understood the implications, he uncovered something else, an unexpected insight into the mechanics of the marriage, the public image, and the private reality. Something subtle, powerful, and undeniable that reframed everything he had accepted about the past. It was a strategy of endurance, a protective shield, and a form of self-preservation. Throughout his marriage, throughout the divorce, and throughout the years that followed, Trevor did not publicly air grievances. He did not respond to speculation. He did not react to rumors or narratives being written without him. And yet, in hindsight, He realizes that this silence was louder than any argument could have been. Have you ever stayed quiet when speaking might have felt easier, only to discover that silence speaks volumes? From the beginning, Trevor had a reflective nature. He observed, processed, and internalized rather than reacting immediately. In the early days, this manifested as patience. During the height of her rising career, it became caution. During the divorce, it became restraint. He recognized that any reaction could be misconstrued, misrepresented, or weaponized. And in Hollywood, perception is reality. Trevor's